Welcome back. It's Doable Discipleship, and I'm Doug Jones. And to my right and to my other right, it's
Rob Jacobs
and
Jason Wheeland.
Well played, guys.
Thank you. I said my name well.
Since no one knows where we are and we have a portable backdrop, let's say we're at the former site of the Garden of Eden, broadcasting not live, but after the fact, because that's how podcasts work.
Are we east of Eden?
And since no one knows where that is,
Good book.
this is a fun imagination exercise. All right, last week we talked about worldview, and it was important. It was an important discussion. Today we're continuing the talk about worldview by examining the first of 4 questions that we said a good worldview needs to answer. The things that we observe, the questions that we know linger in the human heart, how do we answer them? First, how did everything begin? How did all that we see come to exist? Second, why are things the way that they are? Third, how can things be made right? And fourth, how will everything end? Today we're talking about that first one, which is how did everything begin in the first place? Every good worldview needs to account for this. Lots of different worldviews paint this picture a lot of different ways.
It's a big question.
But we don't think they're all necessarily logical, rational conclusions. So let's get into that. First, you want to take us into a little bit on why origins are important? Like, why does it even matter? Why should we care how things came to exist?
Right. Well, origins are important because it carries implications of what is valuable. If we believe that we're valuable, if we believe that we have worth, if we believe that those things are intrinsic to us and inherent in us, then how we came to be would ultimately be answering those things. And even if it's true, it doesn't make sense to believe that we're valuable. It doesn't make sense to say that we're worth and we have purpose if we don't believe that we are created by God, that we somehow just arose through the primordial ooze and through chaotic random selection. Here we are. If you look at kind of the biological materialistic view of things, it's going to say, well, natural selection, the strong survive, the weak die. And I don't think there's any one of us who, at least as a believer, would think, well, that's good, right? Like there's a reason that we believe that people are valuable and that the weak should not just die and should not just be, they should be like, and that's an origins question, right? That becomes from our belief in our origins. The idea of survival of the fittest, that's a materialistic view, but we don't hold to that because we believe our origin gives us value and worth, and we have the image of God. And so there's this idea that we need to, care for others, even the weak, our children. You look at even the way God designed kids. I mean, they stay with us a long time. Some of us for a really long time. I mean, some of us are still in our garage at our parents. But so there's even you just look at that and say God's just done a little thing different with man.
It's interesting to note also that wherever you stand on the place of evolution in the historical progression of life, it really doesn't matter from a Christian worldview. Like, you don't really need to say like evolution's wrong, blah blah blah, which a lot of Christians typically do. But the point I want to make here is that still doesn't answer the origins question. Even taking a strictly evolutionary worldview does not answer the question of where did life come from.
That's right.
No one knows the answer. Science has not produced an answer to that question. And I think that one is going to resist being discovered. So this origins question is extremely important because having a known, like if your worldview has a known start, then everything kind of proceeds from that initial moment. That moment matters. For all the reasons that you've already stated. But I think that's harking back to last week's discussion about worldview, that your worldview needs to be able to account for the big things that we see in the world. And not every worldview can even account for the very existence of the universe or the very existence of life itself.
So thinking back to that, so in the last episode we were talking about what we call the law of causality, right?
Yeah.
So we said that there are 3 laws that relate to that. That anything that has a beginning has a cause, and we said that the universe has a beginning. And so therefore the universe had a cause. And then we also kind of talked about that leaves us then with 2 options on origin for us, that no one created something out of nothing, which would be the believer's view, the atheist view, that there's no God, there's no transcendent being, and they created something out of nothing. Where the believers, and us as Christians, say that someone, a creator, a designer, God, created something, us, the world, the universe, out of nothing. So those two views have massive ramifications as they play out into our lives and into our societies.
So here on, we'll be talking primarily from the Christian perspective. We're now going to be telling the Christian story. We're going to be telling the story of reality, from the stance of the Christian worldview. So lots of different ways of telling the story, but this is the one that obviously we hold to. Probably the one that you hold to if you are a regular watcher of the show. But wherever you come from, this is where you can kind of hear the basics laid out. So Jason, why don't you take us into the first big question? How did God create?
Yeah, so how did God create? We got a couple of big points that we're going to be touching on here, but the first big one, I think that Rob just mentioned kind of briefly as he was talking, is this idea of, is God created out of nothing? And really, that's a huge concept to think about, because our human minds really can't comprehend the idea of nothing. Like, if you think about nothing, you usually think of blank space. Well, there's no space. Think about that.
Yeah, like, imagine there were no space.
Yeah, there's literally no such thing as light or dark. There's no such thing as space.
It's so hard to imagine, because whatever you're imagining, that's still imagining something.
Yeah, you're smuggling some image of something into
I'm imagining
your
a blank void. That's something.
Well, good job. You just label a void. Yeah. So what we're talking about is nothing. So no space, no time, no matter, no energy. Literally just God.
Ex nihilo. Is that the...
Nihilo.
Yes.
Yeah, Nihilo. Yeah.
It's creatio ex nihilo, whatever. It's the term. But yes, so literally creation out of nothing. So, and yes, there is like a debate on what the timeline of creation is. There's some people who think it's an old Earth versus a young Earth approach. So it's either billions and billions of years ago, or it's thousands of years ago, or whatever. We're not going to get into that debate here. Yeah. But the main point, the crux of this that we need to have this foundation on, is that God created everything out of nothing.
Yeah. Sheer nothing.
Yes.
All right, Rob. What about the objection that people raise? Like, so there are some who challenge the idea that God created the universe with the question, well, who created God?
Right.
What's the answer to that?
Yeah, so the very question is an illogic question, because it's a definition question. They're confusing the definition of God. God, by definition, is just like Jason was talking about space, time, matter, and energy. God, by definition, is outside of all of these things. So he is eternally existent. He had no creator. He is the uncreated being. Yeah. So he did not come from a creator, because then that would presuppose logically, well, then who created that? So God is the being that has existed forever. He's been outside of time. He's been outside of space. He's been outside of matter. And so that's basically, he's the uncreated one. I mean, that's...
the question of who created God is silly, because God by definition was uncreated. And this is why it gets hard, because you have to reach outside of time, like you were saying a second ago, because also, like, what, God has existed forever? And when you say forever, you probably mean for
a long
infinite
time?
regression of time, like an infinite regression back and an infinite regression forward. But you forget that time is a thing that God made. God created time.
Yeah.
Time is not something that God is caught up within the way we are. Like, God doesn't live in the continuum of time. He lives outside of it entirely. Like, time is to God what a pebble in your hand is. It's just...
It's not like God was sitting around going, I've been around for so long.
Eons and eons. Infinite amounts of time.
And physicists, they have a hard time saying even what time itself is. If you say, well, what is time? Well, it's a measurement of things that have happened. Yeah, but the measurement, great. But what itself is time? I know how you're measuring it. You're measuring with minutes, hours, and seconds. But tell me what it is. Well, I'm not exactly sure what that is.
Yeah. So when you say like God existed before creation, that doesn't even make sense, actually, because there was no before. There was no time continuum to refer to.
Right.
This is where we have to acknowledge the transcendence of God, that God does not play by the rules of his own creation in this sense. God is not bound by the rules of his own creation. He is not contained within the things that he has made.
And we have to also acknowledge then our own finiteness.
Right.
We do not have minds that are capable of thinking.
But it's why God calls himself I am.
Yeah.
It's it's just is.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense
can't-
to say I was, I will be, although those things are said because God has personally inserted himself into the timeline of history and in that personal and intimate way with mankind and with creation. But to try to contain God within that makes no sense at all. And this is really, really important. So if you eliminate time, then this idea of eternality and before this and after that breaks down. And the problem of God just simply existing isn't really an issue. It's not really a logical problem because you're separating God from the laws that govern the world that he made. So that I am thing is such a, it's the ancient Hebrews could never have known, what the power in that statement is just incredible. Those two simple, actually, there's one word, that Yahweh word, is just so meaning packed. Like I neither was nor will be. I simply am.
Yeah,
At all times.
so
I am.
meaning packed that even the Israelites they didn't like to use that word because there was so much power and meaning in that they would just say the word.
And not to be chronological snobs or anything like that. Like we're not saying that we have any better grasp of that either. Like you hear us wrestling with with the idea of eternity and infinity and nothingness. Like we still can't get our heads around those ones. But man, powerful, powerful stuff. We also know, so God created out of nothing. No one created God. God is the uncreated being, and he is the only one. We also know he created an orderly world that's governed by predictable laws. This creation that he has made operates on the basis of laws that we can predict. In fact, that's what enables a study. We have a discipline that we call science because of those predictable laws.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without those predictable laws, there would be no basis for discovery. This would be a bizarro world where anything could happen at any time, and there would be no rational basis for anything that occurs around us.
Dogs
there would
and
be
cats
no
living together.
pandemonium.
Yes, it's interesting that even those laws, mathematics, physics, logic, that those very things point to a creator because it would be impossible for us to be able to explain anything without those things. So when people say, well, logically, I can deduce that there is no God, it's like, actually, logic itself proves there is a God because you can't appeal to anything else if you don't have those things. And God is the giver of these laws of physics and mathematics and logic and those sorts of things.
The evidence of mind in creation that God's thought process has been planted in creation. Oh, by the way, I want to go back to this idea of out of nothing before we pass on. A couple weeks ago, Pastor Rick talked about the Big Bang on the weekend,
Right?
And you made the point last week in our talk about how Rick said this is the classic thing that if you've got a Big Bang, the laws of causality dictate that there must be a Big Banger. There has to be someone who initiated that. So Christians actually. Let me put this to rest. Christians don't necessarily have to take issue with the Big Bang. Now, we don't necessarily have to, we're not going to get into all the particulars of various cosmologies. We're not going to do that here. But Rick said, I'm good with the Big Bang. He's like, where there's a Big Bang, there's a Big Banger.
Yeah.
But what I think is very interesting is if you hear from a physicist, they'll tell you that what Christians claim happened at the moment of creation, that God created matter, space, time, and energy. That's exactly what scientists claim happened at the point of the Big Bang. They say that there was no space, that the Big Bang was an actual expansion of space. Space came into existence, time came into energy, matter, all came into existence in this event. So it's very peculiar.
And that's interesting
to
too,
find
because
the
and to
coincidence.
speak that science itself changes. So we always say, science is science is changing itself. For many years, scientists thought that the universe was eternal.
Right.
And now, they've come to the same place that Genesis 1 is. In the beginning, the word is spoken and things,
The universe is expanding, but it will contract.
And just as with the origin of life, there's no answer to the how. There's a lot of theories that are postulated, but there is no knowledge of how the universe came. But yes, that's actually interesting. In fact, when I was doing my undergrad, I took an astronomy class, and even at that time, there was still a holding to this idea of this infinite expansion and contraction, that the universe expands in a Big Bang, and then gravity takes over and eventually pulls everything in. Scientists now believe that that's not the case at all. In fact, the expansion of the universe seems to be increasing in speed. How can that be? Dark matter, dark energy.
I was going to say, you want to get into it.
Not to get into all that.
That sounds fun.
Not to get into all that. But very, very powerful truth. Again, always psychs me out because let me put another one to rest. Christians are not enemies of scientific discovery. In fact, historically, Christians and science have more often than not gone together. We love to see this universe understood better. I think that's one of the gifts that God has given us, is the ability to explore this unimaginably huge, complex, and gorgeous creation that he's made. But also that we don't do that at the expense of like Romans 1 says, denying the maker
Right.
and worshiping the thing that was made.
In fact, a lot of those scientists who would study creation and or just cosmology or astrology or mathematics, they did so because they believed in God and knew, well, God is a rational being and has created these laws. So therefore, these things are things that we could perceive and understand and study. Again, without those laws, what is there to study and what is there to perceive? There's just no rationale for anything. So the early science relied upon that, made that assumption that those things existed.
Yeah. Good stuff. All right. Onward, we also know that God created in a personal way. So we know that God has intimate knowledge of his entire creation and that he's made himself present within it, that God is here with us. This is the two theological words we use is God's omnipresence, which is the idea that God is present always, everywhere, and also his immanence, which is the idea that God is not just transcendently omnipresent or omnipotent, all-powerful, but that God is also imminently close, like he is here with us, like
Right.
close as your next heartbeat kind of thing, like always present all the time. And there are a couple of passages that we pulled for this, and there are many passages that we could have pulled for this. We just grabbed two of them. The first one is Isaiah 40, verses 25 through 26, and I'll read each of these real briefly. This one says, "To whom will you compare me?" This is God speaking. "Who is my equal?" asks the Holy One. "Look up into the heavens. Who created the stars? He brings them out like an army, one after one, calling each by its name. Because of his great power and incomparable strength, not a single one is missing." So this verse gives us this picture of God having named the stars, that every single one is individual and he is aware of them all. So this deistic God, this idea that God created and left and is no longer present in his creation, is refuted by this passage here. God not only made the universe, but he also is present within it and is conscious of every activity that's happening on the grandest scale, as we see through these, the stars of the sky, but also in the more intimate and close up, the macro scale here in Job 10, verse 10 through 12. It says, "You guided my conception and formed me in the womb. You clothed me with skin and flesh, and you knit my bones and sinews together. You gave me life and showed me your unfailing love. My life was preserved by your care." So God is actively involved in the continuation of life. We even have passages that say that it's by him all things are held together.
Yeah, all things are held together.
Yeah. Interesting stuff that we could go into there, but shouldn't do that. Jason, why don't you take us into the next big question?
Well, before I forget, I wanted to hit on, there's this new song that just came out. I think it's by Hillsong. It's called "So Will I," or 100 Billion Stars is what it's called. And it's basically, it's this song about creation. It's about how God, how he caused everything and how he, everything bows to him ultimately.
That's good.
So I would check out that song. It's really cool. Anyway,
You're welcome, Hillsong.
there you go. I know, free plug.
It just blew up.
Whoa.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Why did God create? This is a big point because it's not like God was compelled, by some outside force to create. That's not the case. God created for his own a pleasure, I think is the word that, God created for his own pleasure. He wanted to create. He wasn't being poked into creation. He wasn't like, hey,
No one dared
do
him.
this. Yeah, it wasn't a dare. It wasn't like
He wasn't bored.
and that's a big point. Is he wasn't bored. He wasn't sitting around going, what to do. No, God created for his own pleasure. He wanted to. He did not need to create it. And creation is an expression of God's goodness and his originality. Everything that we see, the entirety of the universe, is an expression of how creative and original God is. They're literally, like, you see the pictures of like the universe, of like the nebula clouds, of the quasars, of the super, all this stuff like that, and you're like,
or the filaments when you pan back to like the broadest picture that
exactly.
we can see.
It's so crazy to look at, and you're like, wow. And what we should be saying is, wow, is God so cool?
Yeah.
That he forms all this stuff, and with intention. I
Yeah.
think is a big point. It's not like he just made it and just let it do its thing. Is he knew everything, and he continues to hold and to preserve, as we talked about just a minute ago.
Yeah.
And a big point in this is he made everything for his own sake. It's because he wanted to.
Yeah.
And so as we talk about what it means to have a worldview and to answer this question of how did it all begin, or where does it all come from? When you think about that, God created for his pleasure, for his own sake. He didn't need to create, but he chose to. He wanted to.
Yeah.
That is a huge point in developing a worldview.
Yeah. This point has long been a motivator for worship for human beings. And Rick, in the same message that we referenced earlier, he was talking about how we can see God's handiwork. We can see the things that he has done and know quite a bit about him just based on what we see. But I'm struck by, you use that word originality, is just like everything that human beings create is derivative, right? Everything that we do is inspired by something else that exists within creation. God created the universe without any frame of reference, it's completely original.
Nothing
it
that
is
we
not
can even
derived
think
from
of, yeah.
anything. So it's like, it's staggering that God could just trying to like, just not, of course, not even trying to comprehend, but just to like reflect on the mind of God and the incredible complexity that he's made. And he did it just sheerly out of his own creative power.
Yeah. And not only that, but also he did it and he said that it was good.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? That's a big
That's
point.
really important.
Colossians 1:15-17 says, he existed before anything was created and is supreme over all of creation. For through him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. That last line in particular, everything was created through him and for him, pretty much sums up this idea of how God created it and why it was for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For his glory.
This is a bigger question, and we'll kind of land it here, and this could be a whole nother episode. But it is interesting to see how the Trinity is present in creation, and that speaks again to worldview, because God is not just singular. God is, the idea of the Trinity of three persons, and they were already existing in this perfect relationship of love. So God is creating out of this overflow of his love. He's getting glory from it. But again, just interesting to think about if you even just say, well, I believe in just a creator, but is it really the God of the Bible? Is it the Trinity? Because there's something unique and powerful in that. So just another thing to consider.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about what is humankind. So what are human beings in relation to this God? We know that according to the Bible, human beings are very much like any other creature, at least any other terrestrial creature. We, like all mammals, have hair, produce live young. We have to eat
It's like
and
a
breathe
biology
and drink
textbook.
and all that stuff. Like, we have commonality with physical beings, right?
Yeah.
So we know that in
We're
a
all
sense,
cellular, molecular, DNA.
in a sense, there is an animal element to human beings, but we know that there is also this crazy, really interesting and powerful dynamic that exists with human beings as well, that we are made in the image of God, that we possess his image. And we can talk briefly about what that means, but in essence, human beings are not mere animals, but we also, while we exist physically, we also have a spiritual element or a spiritual facet to our existence, that we're creatures who have a unique ability to live in this created world, to live in this physical world, and yet also relate meaningfully with God. And so you can kind of boil down this made in the image of God thing to basically mean that human beings were made by God good, and we'll talk about what happened next week and how things seem so not good now, but God made us to be good. He made us in his image, and that in making us in his image, he made us to possess enough of his own qualities that personal, meaningful relationship between us and him might be possible. That's, I think, the easiest way to boil it down. we possess many of the same qualities that make God God. And we do so, it seems, in contrast to any other created being. Even the angels aren't described as being made in God's image. Certainly no other animal is described as made in God's image. So this is a powerful aspect of human existence that sets us apart.
Right.
It makes us unique in all creation, at least as far as we know, at least as far as is revealed in the scriptures.
Yeah.
And that is a powerful, powerful truth to come to grips with.
And though we came from dust, and will return to dust, we are the beloved dust, as Jamin Goggins' book once is titled. But and there's that uniqueness of the human position, as we have a responsibility and an authority to creation that God has given us, and you see that in Genesis. And so while we are part of creation, we stand apart from it. Because of the uniqueness of being made in God's image and our responsibility and role to creation, which we do so poorly at.
Yeah. Well, and God, there's an aspect of this too that, and Kokel talks about this in his book, which we referenced last week, Greg Kokel's The Story of Reality, that human beings, unlike animals, possess moral instinct. That we don't hold animals accountable really for doing bad things to each other. Like they eat each other, they attack each other, grizzlies will kill baby grizzlies. Like just this stuff happens, and we don't consider it to be a moral thing. We just see it as animals behaving instinctively. They're just doing what they do. But human beings are different. We're held to a different standard. We hold ourselves to that standard, and from the biblical worldview, we believe God holds us to a higher standard. Because, as you said, we were made with authority over this creation. That God created us and then gave us this interesting. It gave us the office of overseer,
right?
Which we've abdicated the throne of this world in so many ways, which we'll again talk more about in the future. But this is extremely important to understand the place of mankind, and there is I'll let you guys speak to this too, but there's an objection against Christianity that it's narcissistic to think of human beings as like the center of this universe. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think you're making a strong point about just when you look at the uniqueness of man, and if you start to compare worldviews, to say that we're all the same as every animal, and then hold yourself above that and hold yourself to a different standard, you're not living with integrity in your own worldview.
Yeah.
So if all of us are just the exact same and we just arose out of natural selection, and we can get in all the science of it, but then you somehow put yourself above animals or live differently, then somehow you're not being consistent with your worldview. Now, if you hold that you were created, that you're unique, that you were designed, that the image of God lives in you, then you should absolutely be holding yourself to a different standard and accountability. But it's interesting to me that the non-theist view or the materialist view of people talk about the origins of humanity, and just the idea where you're just one of many animals, and it's like, yeah, but you don't live any way like that. You hold yourself to a complete different standard, and why are you doing that? Or why don't you hold those animals to that same standard? Like when you said when other species eat their young, or animals attack other animals, and we don't hold to that in humanity, right? Like murder is murder, but in the animal kingdom, it's just the law of the jungle. So,
for us, the death of the weak is considered an injustice.
Exactly, and then the other way, that's natural selection at its best. That's enhancing the strength of the species. So, just again, that consistency of, are you really living the way you're saying you believe? Because most people are not doing that.
Yeah. Like going back to what I was saying, like there's I've heard it said, I've watched some debates, and I hear people bring this up sometimes. They think like the Christian worldview places human beings on a pedestal that they say they aren't worthy to be placed on, and you might even say that fallen human beings maybe don't deserve that pedestal in some senses. But they submit this argument that, are you saying, Christians, that amidst this vast creation, so vast we don't even really see the end of it yet, but what we do see is so incredibly vast and so huge, and we within it are so insignificant and small, how can we possibly see ourselves as having some special relation to some transcendent being, and among all this creation, that God would take notice of us? Which, by the way, even like the psalmist marveled at that idea, that God would take note of people so small as us in comparison to creation.
Who am I?
But one thing that I've heard said before, John Lennox made this point before, and he does so eloquently, but he talks about how size and value are not the same. Even Rick has said babies are small, but we still treat them with incredible value. A baby's smaller than a car, but we value a baby over a car. But there's also this truth, remembering the perspective of God, that size is irrelevant to God. Like we think well, because we are just tiny creatures that inhabit a tiny planet in a comparatively tiny galaxy, in an obscure part of that galaxy, in an obscure cluster, and they say that because we're so insignificant in terms of size, that we're insignificant in terms of value. And that is an important value judgment that dictates how you see human beings. But I think it's actually, I think, pretty interesting, and I think it's a statement on God's behalf to say that within all of this that I've made, I do look at you as special. I do see you as valuable. And the second we stop looking at ourselves that way, that's when terrible human suffering is inflicted upon people by people. Like as soon as you start deprivileging human beings in creation, you give yourself permission to treat people as less than human.
Right.
You give yourself permission to treat people with horrible contempt, to forget about the needs of others, to oppress the weak or even eliminate the weak. All kinds of evil can flow from that. And again, on our worldview, we can use the word evil and mean it, and it means something. But I think this is so important that we get this perspective of human beings, that God made us to be good, and that God made us for relationship to Him. And He gave us all the tools, all the attributes that are necessary to have meaningful relationship.
And I think that, again, speaks to the 40 Days of Prayer campaign as well. Like, this is who is praying to God. That you were not just some, lowly, unloved, clump of biological matter, that we are saints in God's eyes. I mean, this is who He wants to pray. So again, this should just be reminding you that when you're praying, not only are you praying to this amazing God, but you have worth and value, and that's why God wants to communicate with you. You're His child.
Yeah. So we've covered the origins, and I know we could say a lot more about this, and luckily we have an indefinite number of future episodes, so we will undoubtedly be back to the origins conversation in the future, because there's so much more to say that we just can't fit into this episode. But again, we want to cover, excuse me, still getting over this tickle cough. We want to cover those 4 big questions, and so we've kind of begun with the origins question today. How did everything begin? Next week, we're going to talk about basically where things went wrong, because regardless of the worldview you hold, you acknowledge that the world is not as good as it ought to be, or as good as it could be. That's why you still feel this gut-level reaction to the injustice and the horrible things that you see occurring in the world, regardless of where you stand, or, as Rob said, what you claim to believe. Because you may claim to believe in a worldview that doesn't acknowledge tragedy as tragedy. It simply is what it is. But yet, there's something in you that responds with maybe anger, with outrage, with pain and sorrow when you see terrible things happening. So tomorrow we're going to talk about next week we're going to talk about under the biblical worldview.
Aggressive.
News to us.
Yeah, that's going to be a quick turnaround. We're going to talk about under the biblical worldview how things went wrong, and then the weeks following we'll talk about how they can be made right. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.
Are we not going to do doable steps? This is
my
doable
bad.
discipleship.
I forgot.
Bring us home, Jason.
Bring
Come
us
on.
home.
Oh, well, okay.
Come on,
Okay.
I'm glad you. See you next week. And with Jason.
Yeah.
Cut Doug's mic, Jason.
If you're still here, we're going to talk about some doable steps.
These morning recordings, man.
I know. They're getting to
I have
me
no
too.
brain in the morning.
Okay, so we wanted to mention a couple of things. First off is we have a course at Saddleback called Foundations. We've talked about it a few times throughout the show. It's written by Pastor Tom Holliday and Kay Warren. Covers the 11 core truths about the Christian faith, and one of which is creation. So there are 2 weeks in the course that are spent on the topic of creation. So it's in the new year. Foundations is going to be kicking off at a bunch of campuses. So be on the lookout for that. You can go to saddleback.com/maturity and you'll see info on all of that coming up. Another thing that we wanted to mention is a book by a friend of Saddleback, former pastor at Saddleback, Lee Strobel, called Case for the Creator, which is just a great book that really gets into a bunch of the science stuff. If you're sitting there going like, wow, I could really have used more science, then this book might be for you. So you can go and check out that book.
Do I have to do math?
You do not have to do math. So there you go.
For you.
It's all, but yeah, exactly. It's laid out perfectly for you. So that's a great book, along with the books that we talked about last week, which was The Story of Reality,
Mm-hmm.
Stealing from God by Frank Turek, and Finding Truth by Nancy Piercy.
Yep.
I remembered those. Great.
And Doug, you referenced John Lennox. He has a book, 7 Days, another great book in this area.
Yeah. By the way, you may have noticed. I mean, if you've read Genesis 1 and 2, and you know, like, okay, the Bible says that there were these 6 days of creation, then a seventh day of rest. We didn't touch on that today because the timeline of creation wasn't really super important to the discussion. But yeah, that'd be a great way for you to learn more about. So what exactly are these 7 days of creation? How do we interpret that, or how are the ways that can be interpreted?
You
may
just
look
get
more
to
into
enjoy his accent,
Well, yeah.
which is great.
I don't know if you can read in an accent. I guess you could just
That's
mimic
true.
his accent.
Listen to the audiobook.
Jason can
Well,
read it in
ladies
accent.
and gentlemen, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
He's got that British English combo, or excuse me, British Irish
exactly.
combo.
I do
Before
believe you
read-
can walk on water because he created water.
Yeah. Yeah, before you
fun
read,
times.
make sure to go on YouTube or something like that and just type
Yeah.
in John Lennox.
You need to have
and just
John
get
Lennox's
his voice in your head.
Maybe he does the audio version.
You
Go
should
to
look
Audible
into
and
that,
see if he
yeah.
does his own reading. I could see him doing his own reading, and it would be so good.
The other thing we wanted to mention is to go back and read the account of creation from the Bible. So read the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Hold off on chapter 3 because we'll get to that next
Yeah.
week. But read the first 2 chapters.
Cool.
That's what I got.
Sweet. Thanks for watching or listening. I mean it this time. We'll see you next week. If you're a podcast listener and you enjoyed this episode, consider giving us a rating or a review on iTunes. If you do, you'll help other people find us in the future. And if you're thinking, hey, listening's great, but is there a way I can watch these episodes? Yeah, there is. Subscribe to the Saddleback Church YouTube channel for video versions of these conversations, plus lots of other video content. And if you're already watching us on YouTube, subscribe to the podcast so you can listen in the car or wherever else you go. Lastly, you can always get in touch with us by emailing maturity@saddleback.com. Send us your thoughts, send us your questions, your Bible questions, your life questions, whatever. Who knows? Your question just might inspire an upcoming episode. Thanks again for tuning into Doable Discipleship. I'm Doug Jones, and I hope you'll join us again next week.